Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mark Zakaria. This is Common Sense. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us. As you know, we have today our interview with Gary Sass, the founding director of the Hassenfeld Institute of Public Leadership. We're here on the campus of Bryant University talking to Gary. And Gary, before we proceed, please just give us a quick summary of what the Hassenfeld Institute is and does.
Okay, the Hassenfeld Institute, came about through the generosity of the Hassenfeld Family Foundation. And its mission, in a very simply stated phrase, is to work with state and local officials, both elected and unelected, to help them develop the tools and skills they need to be effective leaders.
Excellent, excellent. And what we've been talking about so far indicates that effective leadership wouldn't be a bad thing to have a little more of. In this segment, we'd like to talk a bit about state finances, and it's a pretty broad subject, of course, not just the annual budget, but also pension funds, post-employment benefits, bonding discipline, and there are others. You are obviously very critically interested in all of them and had your hands in all of them when you were the chief of administration for the state. Would you talk a little bit about what the primary financial problem is facing the state today?
Well, it's too much spending and too little revenue. You can put it in simple terms. You've asked a very broad question, so let's start out generally with state finances and the state budget. Principal problem with the state budget is we never balance it. The budget that was enacted by the Assembly just a few months ago, back in June, has a structural deficit. About $123 million used to balance that budget comes from the previous year's fund balance. And so we never get into structural balance, where current revenues equal current expenditures. And that is okay in good times, but as soon as the economy goes bad, the budget crisis comes up. So the first thing to do is to really adopt a truly balanced budget, which we haven't done for years.
Well, we have a balanced budget statement in the state constitution,
the budget is balanced, but when I talk about structural balance as a fiscal conservative, it's having a budget where I spend as much as I take in from current revenue. And if I have reserves, I could use those.
I understand that. And the point that I was trying to make was that over and over again we see leadership in the House and sometimes in the administration accepting wildly out-of-line estimates because it all adds up to balance. Everyone can say we have a balanced budget. And then the next day, it's like the treasurer saying we're going to make 7.5% on the pension fund. I don't think Warren Buffett could do that.
No, we'll come to that, to the pension fund. The method they use to project revenue is not all that bad. They have a revenue estimating conference. They develop a consensus number. And the consensus number is a reasonable estimate, but it's a question of not getting control on spending. So the first issue is a lack of structural balance. If you look at what that means, and you look in the out years, because the budget is more than 1 year, it's out years as well, there are out year deficits. Next year, in the years starting this July, we have a deficit of about $200 million, and so that's about 5% of spending. If you program it out to fiscal 21, which is July of 20, the deficit grows to almost 9% of budget. It grows to over $330 million. And so and results from a very simple reason. If you look at the average projected growth in revenues, it's about 2.6, 2.7%, and the average annual projected growth in spending is about 4%. So that is simply as you can define as a problem. And what that means, and why out-year deficits are important, and why structural balance is important, you're right. You mentioned earlier that constitutionally we have to have a balanced budget. But if you're constantly fighting the battle of closing deficits, closing out-year deficits, not having structural balance, then you can't make decisions to grow the economy of the state. You can't make decisions on tax policy to reduce tax burdens. You can't make the decisions to invest money, whether it's in infrastructure or whether it's in other areas. And so the revenue situation, the budgetary situation of the state effectively keeps us in neutral. It's not that big a deficit that you can't paper over it each year, but it's like a cold. You're never healthy enough to do what you need to do, and that in a lot of ways is a major challenge at state.
What I'm hearing from what you're saying is that the folks up on Smith Hill understand the problem. They're
Very
just
well.
ignoring it. They're just making believe it isn't there.
Well, they understand the problem. I think they understand it very well, and they're being responsive to pressures from various interest groups, and that's a big part of the problem. They really need to sit back and almost say, we should adopt a budget where the growth in revenue and the growth in spending are in parity. And so if you look out 5 years and you're projecting revenues to grow about 2.5% a year and spending to grow by 4% a year, you're always making bad decisions. And no one, whether it's a business or a smaller government or this university, can make good decisions with that kind of structure.
So the short answer is the state has to spend less.
It has to control the rate of growth in spending, right? And it has to adjust priorities. And a good example, you talk about some of the issues, and I'll get into one of my favorite subjects, is Obamacare. So we rushed to expand Medicaid coverage under Obamacare. And the federal government says, don't worry about it, the feds are going to pay 100%. Well, in a year or so, we have to pay 10%. And so we have this ballooning area of expenditure, and now 10% comes online because of the state share. And so we have to think of those things ahead of time. You mentioned pensions. I don't know how much time we have, but the pension issue it really happened in 3 cycles. First cycle is Governor, at that time Treasurer Raimondo came in and said something's wrong with this pension system, and she does some very useful work, and we find out that the rates of return are unrealistic, the mortality rates are unrealistic, and she adjusts it. And as a result of the adjustment, the unfunded liability goes way up. Goes up by almost $2 billion, I think. Second step is we go through and we adopt pension reforms, some very needed reforms. We have a hybrid deferred benefit, deferred compensation plan. We've frozen COLAs, changed eligibility ages. So we reformed some of the provisions of the plan. Third area is what causes concern. We do crony hedge fund investments. I was reading somewhere that our hedge fund growth since 2011, the rate of return on our hedge funds has been about 4.7%. If I had just invested in the S&P Standard & Poor's 500 index, it'd be closer to 15%. And so what does that mean? It means a couple of things. It means we have realistic projections on what the growth is in return of investment. We've made bad investment decisions by using hedge funds, and I want to commend the General Treasurer for pulling back on that. I don't know what took him so long to get there.
I was going to say finally.
But yeah, but he did get there, so better late than never. And what will happen now is we've already gone to the employees. We've negotiated reductions in their benefits. And now we're finding out that the assumptions on rate of return on investment, 7.5% a year, which you mentioned earlier, Warren Buffett, couldn't achieve, using hedge funds, just getting away from simple indexation, are causing a hole. So what happens then is if the unfunded liability, goes back up, come to taxpayers. And one example, I'm sorry, Jim.
Oh, just briefly, we're coming to the end of our segment, and what I have to say is that what we've proven here, if nothing else, is that we could do an entire interview on this subject.
Yeah.
For now, however, I am going to have to cut it short because time is the ruler of a TV show, and someone is about to step in and ask our satiric question again, are you kidding me?